We tend to take liberties sometimes to make assumptions about people based on where they're located. Especially if they live, let's say, in the ghetto or in the bowery, so to speak. We tend to assume that they're part of that and that they have the same character, the same level of intellect, the same level of empathy, and the same level of addictions. So you have to wonder, why would someone be in the so-called bowery or ghetto if they have great talent? Here are a few ideas of mine. First, for whatever reason, they might not know who they are very well. They might have had a childhood in which they were totally invalidated as to who they were by the so-called narcissist or the so-called envious person. Secondly, they may be handicapped in some way other than this having believed in an invalidating assessment of their talents, their assets. They may, for instance, be physically handicapped and be unable to work, and any disability payments they may receive may be utterly insufficient. Or they may have a handicap that is not even covered or considered a handicap in the government's eyes. Or, here is an example too, not often talked about or thought about. They may be doing what you would call caretaking of somebody, providing great assistance to someone handicapped in some fashion. I know, for instance, of one man who was in his 70s who was looking after a 90-year-old mother, and until lately was also looking after a father about that age. And those parents were from South America, and so arguably somewhat handicapped themselves, as per knowing the language and fitting in general. It being said by some that 80% of people from over in other countries, immigrants, shall we say, have issues regarding their mental functioning, shall we say, or stress levels through the roof, I would put it, and inability to find sometimes people they're simpatico with and fit in. Now, sometimes these so-called caregivers, if you will, would rather not see their parents go or their spouse to a, quote, nursing home or other facility, group home, etc. And so they make great sacrifices on the behalf of these parents or spouse or whoever to help them out, so that they would be in the optimal situation. It's kind of a compromised situation then. I know, for instance, a year ago, I met a woman who had given birth to a child, and the child had congenital heart problems, and she devoted her life to looking after this child rather than putting the child in a so-called facility. And later in life, she became a nurse or other practitioner doing the same thing for other people for pay. She sacrificed a great deal to help her child not receive inadequate treatment in a facility during a youthhood period. I know another man who was quite talented. He had gone to Duke University and gotten an advanced graduate degree, taught later in life in the United Arab Emirates, language studies there, and yet later in life found himself back in America and in a very tiny town, much to his dislike, driving a taxi cab to make money, and very bitter about it. I asked him, "Why are you here then? Why don't you leave?" And he said, "My wife has cancer." So I think the bottom line is there are people here and there who we assume to be just like the rest of us if we are in fact in a bowery or toxic location, ghetto, whatever, or disadvantaged area in general. And we make assumptions, thinking that they must be like everybody else. Why wouldn't they leave then otherwise? And I see this as a common thread here, that oftentimes these people are making great sacrifices on the behalf of a loved one whom they know that otherwise would receive horrid treatment often, unless they have millions of dollars per year for deluxe accommodations. So they make a compromise solution. The thought being, how could you pack up and leave a loved one behind knowing that they're going to suffer torturously? That in itself would be so discomforting that one rationalizes or even accurately comes to the conclusion that it's better to stay in that toxic location than to move out and have festering in the back of one's mind how the loved one is doing in actuality, especially if one is too honest to whitewash the whole situation. Now, this is compounded by the sticky topic of euthanasia and how it is not in vogue, so to speak, in our country, especially legally. And so this isn't even an option then for severely handicapped people, if they would even wish to avail themselves of it in older age. And so a loved one who's younger often is between a rock and a hard place, because legal means of euthanasia and even anything by hook or crook is not only legal, illegal, or whatever, but sometimes not available to perform reliably and painlessly. So that too mucks everything up to a sense, and influences greatly a loved one's decision to leave or to stay in a toxic location, and in turn being assumed by some to be part of that milieu. Also untalented, unempathetic in general, etc. I see one last factor that makes some people want to stay in a bowery-like situation, a toxic location, and be misassumed by some people to be part of that. That is when you have a very creative person who would rather just be left alone to do their creative work in a less than talented place where there's very little talent around, rather than be, say, up in New York City with considerable talent all around, but have to sacrifice in terms of time, noise, the envy of some people around you, and so on. They would rather live in a rather bare place, so to speak, even suffer a lot of the opinions of others as to not understanding who they are and why they're there, so that they have certain freedoms in terms of time, and I would add cheap land, cheap rent. So they might not fit in, but it's a compromise solution once again. I would say, in my mind, the best thing of all would be if these people stuck there would toot their own horn, so to speak, in an optimal fashion, and let those around them know why they are there if they're highly talented in some fashion, so that they aren't being assumed by too many people and too strongly to be of the same mold. These are my thoughts at present on this, then.